Hi, my name is Laurel, and I'm what people refer to as a detransitioner, meaning I'm back to living as my birth sex after going through a period of time where I lived according to the delusion I was under that I was a female trapped in a male body. I lived my entire life with this belief that I was somehow a female mind, a female soul, trapped in a male body. I spent my entire childhood and teenage years and early 20s and 30s praying every night that I could somehow wake up with a miracle to be in the right body. It never happened, so when I was in my late 30s and I discovered that medical transition was a possibility for me, I went that route. I took hormones. I even had gender reassignment surgery to cause my body to match how I felt inside. Although it could never fully match. I could never fully be a woman. And over a period of time, I eventually came to the realization that gender identity is entirely formulated in the mind based on personal experience, childhood trauma and things. And when I realized this, I had to return to my birth gender because nothing else made sense. It no longer made sense to live in defiance of my birth gender, so here I am as a man again, and almost 44 years old, and for the first time in my life able to actually love myself as a man. And so I make these videos sharing my personal experience, which, yes, is my own experience, and I can't necessarily speak for the whole of the trans community, but there are things that I learned through this path, and in my training in trauma, various therapy modalities and things, I have come to understand the human psyche and what forms identity, not only gender identity, but any identity or personality trait or any other trait, OCD, ADHD. I have come to an understanding of how these things become a part of our lives that I now feel a need to share my story and the things that I learned throughout this journey of hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery and everything else I've learned about human identity. In my videos, my subscribers are amazing and ask some very good questions that cause me to think about things. And one of the subjects that has come up recently is I've been asked many times if I ever thought or stopped to think about how I was making women uncomfortable by entering their spaces. So, for example, women's locker rooms, women's changing rooms. As a trans woman, when you fully believe with everything you are that you are a woman, you believe you just belong there. You believe that using the women's restroom is just right. And not only that, but when you are presenting as a woman, especially if you pass and you were to go in the men's restroom, even though you were born as a man, you don't really belong there either. You don't fit in. It's very uncomfortable. As genuinely feeling like a woman and being made to go in the men's restroom, it feels violating in a way. It feels like it's hard to describe it. It brings up this extreme feeling of sadness that, see, I will never be accepted. I used to feel that way as a trans woman. I felt like no one is ever going to see me as a woman. No one's ever going to accept me. And there's a reason for that. We live in a world that sees a gender binary. More and more the LGBTQ is spreading this concept far and wide that there exists more genders than just two. And on one hand, it does provide a space where gender non-conforming individuals feel more safe. I felt safer using women's restrooms knowing that there was people advocating for my use of those spaces. But now, after the fact, looking back on it, I want to discuss a few concepts about trans people using the spaces of the opposite sex. Like I said, I felt like I belonged there. And you have to understand that most trans people also feel like they belong there. Because they're in a mental space where they feel like living as the opposite sex is right for them, obviously they're going to feel like everything that goes along with being that opposite sex is right for them. Even down to stupid things like watching a commercial on TV for tampons. A trans woman will watch that commercial and feel a sadness knowing that they are not genuinely female, that they don't have periods, although some trans women claim that they do have periods, and it's the weirdest thing because you were born biologically male. You don't even have the parts inside to have a period. If you're bleeding out of your vagina, there's a problem, a big problem. It's not supposed to happen. There are certain things that as a trans person you just have to accept that you will never fully be the gender or sex or whatever it is that you identify as. It's just not going to happen. We want to believe it. With everything we are, we want to believe that it's going to happen, that we will one day be seen fully as women. I say we because, again, I find myself speaking for other trans people because I'm trying to bring awareness to the mindset of a trans person because I was there. While I can't speak for other trans people, everyone has their own unique experience. I was there, and so I can speak from the perspective of believing that you are a woman. Being born a man, living most of your life as a man, but then somehow developing this belief that you are indeed genuinely a woman and therefore belong in women's spaces. It's really weird. And that's why I know it is a delusion now. Because a delusion is something that you can be in without knowing you're in it. And that's what being trans is. When you honestly believe that you are a woman, but you were born biologically male, that is a delusion. And that's what I was in for a long time. Same with trans men who were born female and believe they're men. I wish so bad that the trans community would listen to us detransitioners more, because we have a lot of wisdom that we gained through that path. Those of us who managed to see enough of the puzzle to come out on the other side and are now back to living as our born gender, while you may see us as something that discredits your validity, we were there. We felt the same way. I felt honestly like I belonged in women's spaces. So again, back to women's spaces. Women's changing rooms. I used to use women's changing rooms because where else was I going to go? I can't go change with the men. I don't have parts, which now as a detransitioner, I'm discovering that I struggle with that just the same. I still can't change in the room with men because I don't have the parts that they're expecting to see. And everybody should have an expectation of privacy. But when you're in a place like that, it's just people change in front of each other, and it's just how it goes. But if you are a gender non-conforming individual and you identify as a woman, it does not feel right at all to change in the men's locker room. And so I used the women's locker rooms to change. Usually it was really uncomfortable for me because, back to the question I've been asked so many times, I've been asked if I ever thought about the discomfort I was causing the women in there. Oh, believe me, I saw the looks on their faces. I knew I was causing them discomfort, and I hated it. I wished I wasn't. I wished so bad. That's what really made me wish that I could pass, because if I could pass fully, I would just be in there among the women and they'd have no idea I was a man. And therefore they wouldn't have been uncomfortable like they were. And so that's the struggle that those of us who cannot pass and are still seen as men, dressed as women, it causes a lot of discomfort for those who can tell that we're still men. And I would usually have my wife and daughter with me. We'd go to the hot springs or whatever, and then we'd go change together in the women's changing room. And that made me a hell of a lot more comfortable, knowing that my wife and daughter were there with me, because a single man in the changing room, that feels a little less safe than one that at least has family, normal appearing people with him to make it appear as though he's at least trusted by someone. But yeah, the times when my wife and daughter would like get done changing faster and leave me there by myself, that was extremely uncomfortable, because yes, I was very much aware that I was in a women's space and that I was making the women in there uncomfortable. And there were times where I tried on purpose to make my lack of a penis visible. Like I'd change in a way that they could see that I didn't have a penis, just so that they would know that at least, even though I was born a man and appear as a man with a wig on, that I don't have the parts to violate them with, or whatever. It was a weird position to be in, and yes, trust me, I was very much aware of the discomfort I was causing them. However, this goes along with the same mindset I had to get to in order to go out in public dressed like a woman. I had to get over that discomfort. In order to function in life, I had to get over those discomforts, and the realization that I was causing women discomfort, I had to push through that discomfort and do it anyway, because I still had to live. And sure, there may be alternatives like a gender neutral changing space. I would often find those, but generally it was easier just to go in the women's changing room. Now another one, my wife and I are into spiritual stuff, and one of the things that my wife and I used to do together is go to women's circles. There are a number of women's healing circles, spiritual healing circles in the area, that the women running the circle would obviously welcome my wife there, and then because my wife supported me in my trans identity at the time, because she loved me so much, she would bring me along as well to these women's circles. Now this again is another place where many of the women who go to a healing women's circle like that have been violated by a man in the past. They've been raped, they had childhood trauma with an abusive father, or they had a past husband that beat them or something, and that's why they're there, to seek safe community among other women where they feel safe, where they have a reasonable expectation that no men are going to be in the space. And so women show up at these women's circles expecting that this is a safe place where they can be vulnerable and be held by other safe women, right? Well, when these women would walk into this women's circle, and there I am, a man, dressed and presenting myself as a woman, I'm still a man. To them, from their perspective, I am still a man. So if they have feelings within their body that is from past relations with a man, or being violated by a man in the past, it makes sense that they would be uncomfortable by the presence of a man. Now, one of the things that really made me think hard about this is my wife and I were at one of these women's circles one time, and we were sitting there in the circle with all the women, and we were meditating or something at the time, and a man that was in the park where we were doing this women's circle, he walked up and he asked if he could join the circle, because I guess he didn't realize it was only women. Of course, I was sitting in the circle, so he probably thought, oh look, it's open to men too. Even though I had a dress on and my long wig on and everything. But the women there told him, no, this is a women's only space. You can't join this circle. Yet I was still there in the circle. And so that made me extremely uncomfortable. I sat there realizing, okay, I was born a man, I identify as a woman now, I'm dressed and presenting as a woman, but here's a situation where this man, who's presenting as a man, living as a man, he's clearly a man, was denied access to this women's circle because he's a man, and yet me, having also been born a man, is allowed to stay simply because I identify as a woman. But also because these women knew me. They knew me from years past and things. But that incident really spoke to me. That incident really made me think about this whole concept of trans women in women's spaces. I kind of pushed through it, and I continued to attend women's circles after that because I came up with the logic in my mind that it's because I present as a woman and I had surgery. I don't even have the male parts anymore, so it's okay for me to be here, I guess. But it does bring up a really good subject that I really wanted to make a video about today. I wanted to talk about this in a way that makes people aware, not only that the trans people who are going into these spaces, really think about what you're causing. I know that as trans people, we try to justify our actions. We justify our presenting ourselves the way we do because this is how I identify. I won't be happy any other way. I have to be this way. But what you have to remember is that the only reason you have that belief is because your past experiences and traumas and things caused you to arrive at that conclusion that you are in the wrong body. It doesn't make sense. Biology speaks volumes. For many, many years, it worked perfectly fine that when a baby was born, you looked at what genitalia it had and you immediately knew whether it was a boy or a girl. Now we have so much infiltration of these weird ideas that gender is not fixed and that you can change your gender, and that not only that, but that there's a whole spectrum of gender. Sure, in your mind can make up all kinds of crazy stuff, all kinds of genders. It's not reality. The reality is the biology that you're male or female. You could have chromosome issues or whatever that make your body actually physically different, but if there are no chromosome issues, it's all in the mind. Gender identity is all in the mind. It is all based on experience, based on programming, based on trauma. And so you gotta remember that you are still going to appear as the gender you were born as to the majority of people, because the majority of people just accept biology as the rule. We could go on all day long about how different gender identities form in the mind based on different experiences, and whether that's valid or whether that should drive your decisions in life or not. You know, when I was identifying as a woman, I of course did not want anybody to tell me that my biology was what determined how I should live my life. I didn't like that, and it's not necessarily true that your biology should determine how you live your life other than how you present sexually. Your gender and sex are the same thing, and they're based on how your body formed. If your body formed with a penis, you're a boy. If your body formed with a vagina, you're a girl. The reality is you're either a boy or a girl, and then you develop all these beliefs that cause you to present yourself in all different ways. And as far as women's spaces again go, women have a reasonable expectation that when they enter a women's restroom, a women's locker room, a women's healing circle, that there are only going to be women there. They do not see a trans woman as a woman. Some women do. Some women are also under the same delusion that gender is on a spectrum. And therefore, there are many women in these women's spaces who will openly welcome you there. They will support your presence there. And God bless those women. They're wonderful, loving, open-minded women that make life a lot easier for a lot of trans-identifying people. They made my life a lot easier by welcoming me there, telling me that they would support me using the women's restroom, because they know I'm just there to go to the bathroom. I'm not there for any ill intention. I'm not there to do anything. Not even there to look at other women. I have my own body. I have a wife. I'm there to change. That is all I'm there for. To change, to use the restroom, or to take part in the women's circle as a woman identifying person. But again, like I said, the reality is that regardless of what my identity formed, regardless of what gender identity I formed over the course of my childhood and my life, the fact is, biologically, I was still male, and therefore will be seen as male in these women's spaces. And one thing that I allowed myself to not consider so much was the fact that in many times in these women's spaces, there are these women that have been abused or taken advantage of by men, and therefore my presence as appearing to be a man, even though I presented as a female, was triggering to these women, would make them uncomfortable. And as a trans person, you become so self-centered, it becomes your everything to be seen as a woman, that you fail to recognize what you are doing to the people around you. I failed to properly account for how my whole transition was affecting my wife. I failed to properly account for how my transition was affecting my stepdaughter. I failed to properly account for how my presence in women's spaces was probably making a lot of women very uncomfortable. Even though there was parts of me that were aware of it, like I said, I had to push through that because I thought I just had to belong there. I thought I had to get over the discomfort because I genuinely was a woman and I genuinely belong in these women's spaces. No. And so then that of course brings up the question, well then where do these trans women go? Where do you change? And I just don't know. This is the problem. And this is one of the reasons I had to detransition, because I realized this problem. The majority of the world recognizes two genders. There is a gender binary, and therefore there are men's restrooms, there are women's restrooms. There are more and more neutral gender restrooms and family changing rooms and things that allow for trans people to feel a little more safe or have a space where they can change, and that's great. But we do live in a world that for the most part there is just this biological gender binary that rules the world, and we're subject to that as humans in this world. And as a formerly identifying trans person, formerly female identifying trans person, I had to eventually come to the realization that this is the rule. And once I realized that and realized it no longer made sense for me to live as a woman, to present as a woman, to dress as a woman, to put myself in women's spaces, because regardless of what identity I developed in my mind, I'm in a world that doesn't recognize that. I'm in a world that eventually, over the course of a long time of me piecing the puzzle pieces together, I eventually realized I am a man. I always have been a man and always will be a man in this life, and that is okay. And I realized that the only reasons I ever developed an aversion to the male parts of myself was childhood trauma and programming. And once I realized that, it didn't make sense to keep going with it. It's kind of like growing up believing that you are disabled when you're not really. You just grew up believing you're disabled, so then you make every decision in your life based on this belief that you're disabled, that you can't do that thing. Or like I mentioned before, exceptionalism. If you have this idea that there's something about you that makes you different than everybody else, then you will make every decision you come to, every fork in the road, you will choose to go down the path that aligns with your current perspective and belief. And that's what happens to someone like myself, who identified as a woman but living in a male body. I made the choices based on that perspective that caused me to eventually seek medical transition, hormones and surgery and things. And going along with that, I also made every other decision, like which restroom to use, which changing room to use, whether to attend women's circles or not, based on this identity, this belief I had, this belief that developed in my childhood. It wasn't reality, it wasn't real, it was a belief. And it was a belief that was so strong that caused me to mutilate my body in response to this belief. This is how strong belief can be, and this is how strong delusion can be. When you are in a delusion, you do not know you're in a delusion. If you were raised your entire life in one little tiny room and you never saw anything outside of that room, you would not have any concept of what the sky is, of what dirt is, of what a giraffe is, anything, because that is your limited perspective that you were raised with. When you grow up with a trans identity, it is like being raised in a tiny little room. You can't see outside of it. You cannot see the reality. You cannot see that you are not actually a woman. You just honestly believe you are, and therefore you believe that you belong in women's spaces. But the reality is you are biologically male, and therefore putting yourself in women's spaces is going to make women uncomfortable that are expecting there to be only women there. Because regardless of whether you're identifying as a woman or dressing up like a woman, you are still seen as a man by these women who have a reason to be afraid of men and men's presence in their spaces. And so this is something that I really wanted to talk about. It's a really sensitive subject because you go trying to tell trans women that they don't belong in women's spaces, and that causes a riot. I too at one time would have fought for that. Like, I'm a woman though. You have to recognize me as a woman. I may have been born a boy, but I'm really a woman inside, and you have to understand this is the reality. And I belong in those spaces. No, I didn't. I never did. I never did. It was a delusion I was under that caused me to think I belonged in those spaces, and I made a lot of women uncomfortable, I'm sure, by doing so. And I am deeply sorry and remorseful for that. But at the same time, I have to recognize that that was the mentality I was coming from. That was the mental space I was in, that I honestly believed with everything I was that internally I was a woman. I'd look down and see a male body, but I felt like, no, I'm a woman. And then that brings up the question, well, what does it actually feel like to be a woman? How could anybody ever say that? You don't know unless you grew up in a female body. That is the experience that makes you know what it means to be something. If you grow up in a girl's body and have all of the experiences that go along with being a girl, having your period and things, you grow up feeling like a girl. If you grow up in a girl's body and you have experiences and perspectives that make you feel like that doesn't align with you, you might grow up feeling like you're a boy in a girl's body. Your identity is formed in experience, and experience is had within this body with the nervous system that we have within this body. All of our senses, our sense of smell, touch, hearing, every sense that is in our body is what we as an identity is experiencing the world from. And if you grow up in a male body and experience everything from the male perspective, and you maintain this perspective that you're a boy and a male, and you grow up into a man, then that's what it feels like to be a man. But if you grow up like I did in a male body, but have experiences and perspectives and things that caused a person like myself to develop this sense of identity that, no, I'm a girl in a boy's body, then that doesn't feel right. It feels like you're in the wrong body, and you develop this identity around this, and your perspectives are built around this identity, and therefore every decision you make is built upon this identity. You make decisions based on the identity that you believe yourself to have. You put yourself in women's spaces because you believe you belong there. So many questions on my YouTube channel that trigger a lot of these thoughts that did you ever stop to consider the discomfort you were causing women in these women's spaces? Like I said, yes I did. But at the same time, being trans is a very self-centered, selfish way to be. It by nature, that's what it is. It's all about identity and fighting for this identity, and therefore it becomes a self-centered, by nature, thing. You fail to account for how the people around you are being affected because it's all about me and me gaining the identity that I'm supposed to have and being happy in my life. And so I just wanted to record this video and these thoughts about whether trans women belong in actual women's spaces. And I really don't think they do. But then again, can you really tell someone who fully believes that they are a woman that they don't belong in those spaces, that will cause psychological harm as well. But psychological harm is possibly being caused to the women who are there who expect to be safe in a women's space where there's no men. Those women likely will perceive a trans woman as a man. And therefore, you have to consider, if you're living with a trans identity, that's one of those sad realizations that basically you just have to understand that this is something weird that you're living with that makes you ineligible for certain things. This world, based very largely on a biological binary rule, has an expectation that if you appear as a man, you're expected to use men's spaces. If you appear as a man, you will be perceived as a potential threat in women's spaces. It's just what you have to acknowledge. You have to recognize that there are women out there who have been abused by men who, quite honestly, who will see a trans woman as a man, and not only as a man, but as a sexual deviant man. Because many people see a trans person as a form of sexual deviancy, because it is a deviancy from the norm, from the biological norm. And it's really sad that people often can't see past things and will see a man dressed as a woman as a sexual deviant, and if they're already afraid of men being in their spaces, and then a man who is dressed up as a woman will especially be seen as unsafe to certain women. Not all women. Like I said, there are some women who recognize trans women as what they perceive them to be. Many women welcome trans women. Like I said, I found women in general to be very loving and welcoming. And I felt welcome and safe in those women's spaces by the women who welcomed me there. But there were other women there who would appear to be uncomfortable. And this is just the reality. If you're living in a way that defies the perceived norm, the perceived biological norm, you will be perceived by many to be a potential threat. And as a trans person, this is just something that has to be acknowledged, has to be recognized. You can't change the world. It's like making the Amazonian River suddenly change course. It would take a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of effort to make such a system change. And we've seen the systems changing to where now this trans ideology is so widespread that it's even in our kids' schools and things. So I don't know what the answer is, I really don't. But if you are a trans person who feels like you belong in the spaces of the opposite sex, just know you're likely making a lot of people very uncomfortable by doing so. And do you want to live with that? Do you want to live with that? I know you want to be happy. I know you want to feel welcome and loved and seen for who you feel yourself to be. I get it. I was there too. But consider the impact of what you're doing. Consider that there are people that are very uncomfortable by your presence, and try to minimize that discomfort as much as possible. I love you all. Thank you for listening to these talks. I hope that they benefit some. That is my utmost hope. I have so much love for my fellow humans, and I see what you're going through. I see the struggle. I've been through my own struggle, my own identity struggles, and I'm here to share what I've learned along the way, and I hope people can get something from it. I love you all. Thanks.